This paper aims to point out elements able to promote a reflection on whether educational theory, at least some of its emblematic current representatives, should rely on a master narrative to be legitimated or guided in a postmodern age marked precisely, according to Jean-François Lyotard, by the disbelief in meta-narratives, or disparately, whether educational theory wouldn't be allowed or even compelled to look for non-meta-narrative goals and grounds. The later alternative can rely, as we believe, on the way narrative and its non-metalization is seen and inserted in theory. First of all, we'll assume that what we call here master narratives are in a sufficient extent similar to Lyotard's description of meta-narrative. Second, such a postmodern condition, of course, is all but new, though it can be said that we live today the unfolding of most of Lyotard's accurate predictions. These perspectives still provide us a powerful set of critical issues to evaluate the relevance of the educational discourse, like the one held by Neil Postman on our present, and in several ways on our future, especially in The End of Education. We'll focus on the narrative issue for this brief paper, which probably should be endless. A rather obvious or direct link between the two opposed theoretical uses of narratives can be drawn, since each one seems to be object of the other's critique. One for suggesting a meta-narrative as a goal end, and thus still being modern. The other for being a postmodern thought, one of the kind Postman labels the metaphysics of meaninglessness, like the philosophies of deconstruction. But there also is a not so apparent, explicit, or undeniable relation of narrative with the idea of two ends. The end of education, Postman, and the end of great narratives itself, Lyotard. In both discourses about the end, there is a menace and a chance, the endlessness of narrativity. This endlessness doesn't mean the end of all narrative, neither the meaninglessness of postmodern theory in the educational field. We'll try to sketch some final lines to begin an argumentation about it. But let us take a closer look at Postman's arguments first. Postman's main argument about the end of education, in the double sense of a goal and of a limit, and a third sense is embedded here, without a goal, education dies, is the need for American educators to inculcate back in the students the lacking spirit and greatness that can be drawn from the American cradle. This proposition could be extended to all claims for national or great narratives able to unite, inspire, or guide the educational actors, syllabuses, and policies. Postman's thesis comes as a reinforcement as well as a confessed conservative revision of his earlier work, Teaching as a Subversive Activity. Most subversive imperatives from 1967 remain up to date. Questioning prior to ready-made answers in the classroom. Adaptation to change as a surviving strategy. The teacher's role as a crap detector, among others. The exception is the role and treatment given to narrative. The gods society believes in, craves for, are narratives. The only alternative is choosing our gods among such narratives. The classroom becomes then a place to resist the outside gods and to recite the story of the inspiring ones, which are the great American experiment and its heroes, Lincoln, Jefferson, etc., the creation of a common public, the great liberal democracy, school as a civilizing space, let's say, a collectively shared narrative. The unwanted gods are consumerism, technology, multiculturalism, insignificance, disorder. And narratives always point out an order, or at least most of the times they point out an order. Postman does not make clear when the teachers and the students' questioning should stop, when the issue is great narratives or meta-narratives. It is through it, though, that modern times created its great heroes, great dangers, great periplus, and mainly the great socio-political and economic objectives, bringing an impossible but desired greatness to a world rather given as bourgeois and capitalist, low and decaying. Moreover, Silviano Santiago reminds us that the postmodern condition is reformist in the eyes of the revolutionaries, irrational and anarchical to the Illuminists, only modernizing to the moderns, but in its own eyes, post-modernity is anti-totalitarian, that is, democratically fragmented, and it is useful to sharpen our intelligence about what is heterogeneous, marginal, sidelined, daily, so that historical reason brings up new objects of study. That was a quote from Silviano Santiago. Note that historical reason is a very interesting formula used by Santiago here. Reason is historical, thus narrative, and despite sharing its name with rationalism, it is fragmented, externalized, marginalized as the creation of its objects of study. We are thinking, for example, here about educational syllabuses and the presence of a master national or public narrative prescribed by Postman. The historicity of reason indicates there is a fading of predetermined essences, ratios, or universal reasons to establish the components of educational narrative. The postmodern condition doesn't refer to a chronological time, but to the fact that alternatives can or should no longer be thought through the dichotomic alternatives, since a great amount of works in many fields of studies and its new objects blurs the series of divisions that constitute modern rationality: language versus reason, subject versus object, science versus society, nature versus culture, representation versus reality, and so on. It also blurs the autonomy of the subject and the correlative avatars of these modern features in educational theory. The educational syllabus as a representation of an external reality, for example, criticism as a neutral point outside a hegemonic discourse, or language as a communicative tool, or as a social ascension asset, etc. By refusing the small narratives and by returning to the modern model, isn't Postman refusing the postmodern condition and giving education a conservative solution, avoiding thus one of the main challenges in education, facing the open consequences of narrativity? To make ourselves clearer, we'll have to outline a definition of a concept that tends to escape to conceptualization, or rather, that is at work when one intends to define the concept of concept itself. Narrativity gathers together the concept and simultaneously delimits its historicity and aperture. There is no simple definition of narrativity. First, because it is non-finite, and it lies at the roots of the non-definition of narratives. Nevertheless, narrativity is not understood here as a pacific or resigned comprehension of discourse, theory, or practice that can't be but narrative. Galen Strawson already warned us about how fashionable it is to claim narrative any psychological or ethical issue. Let's quote him. As for narrativity, it is in the sphere of ethics more of an affliction or a bad habit than a prerequisite for a good life. Narrative is certainly a habit, most often a bad one. In fact, it constitutes or gives shape to most forms of cultural habit, habitus or ethos. When Strawson hollows life's non-narrative events, buried in this craving for unity or identity embedded in the narrativization of psyche and ethics, he tries to denounce a naive conscience over the importance of narrative. But narrativity here is taken for narrative in general, when it should be seen, in our view, in a radically different way. Exactly as the possibility of demarcation from habit in narrative or off narrative. It certainly impels us, on the other hand, to tell. The power of narrativity is, then, ambivalent, ambiguous, unpeaceful. It certainly confronts meta-narrativity as well as narrativization. Tomás Tadeu da Silva, by offering a new perspective on the educational syllabus, a traditional meta-text, and considering it as a fetish, highlights it as a battling representational field, as well as a possible object of desire, that is, the intersection of a political and a poetical issue. On the other hand, let's quote him, there is no identity nor alterity outside representation. The curriculum or syllabus here is at the very intersection between power and representation, a locus of identity and alterity production. There precisely, like knowledge, it becomes a field of battle around representation. On the other hand, as a fetish, it becomes a sign of postmodern times, when it gets harder to maintain not only the old distinctions between nature and culture, science and society, technique and politics, but above all, the distinctions between the human and the non-human. On this later fading border, education is at stake, politically, but above all, poetically, an ongoing and forthcoming task. Education is endless. It endlessly retells its ends, its goals, and its deaths. Thank you.